So I wanted to put together a video on our digestion lab since we're not able to do that since we're all online. One of the first things I wanted to cover is the interesting positioning between the liver, gallbladder, and pancreas, and that can have some fairly serious consequences. So what I would like you to focus on right now is, so here's the gallbladder here, obviously this green thing. And what I'd like to point out to you is this right here is called the common bile duct. And the liver actually makes bile, but the gallbladder stores it and it releases it into the small intestine, the pink thing here, in order to help digest fat. So it's an emulsifier, it breaks down fat. The pancreas, meanwhile, is making a whole bunch of digestive enzymes, and they're not really active until they make it to the small intestine, but if they're not allowed out of the pancreas, they can start to digest the pancreas. One of the problems is if you have a bunch of gallstones, and those gallstones are starting to fill up the gallbladder. Back in the day, they used to kind of let it go for a while, but nowadays they realize these gallstones can come down here block the pancreatic duct. The problem with that is then digestive enzymes cannot make it into the small intestine. So the pancreas makes some pretty strong digestive enzymes and normally dumps those into the small intestine. So the digestive enzymes get stuck in pancreas. And so that's going to lead them, and this is one of our connections that I did before. Sorry, I always do that to pancreas. And what's going to happen then is those enzymes digest pancreas, and that leads to pancreatitis. The problem with pancreatitis, and it kind of extends back to before, is now you can leak digestive enzymes into the blood, and then you start digesting yourself. And the problem with this is all of your cells are bags of potassium. So when you start killing cells, that can lead to hyperkalemia. And then if you've listened to our connections, you realize that can lead to cardiac arrest. So you have to be careful with the pancreas nowadays, or we're much more careful with gallstones because you don't want to have this problem with pancreatitis, and that can create a lot bigger problems. So nowadays, I mean, I'm no doctor, I'm a PhD, not an MD, but it seems like it's much more, we're much more careful about gallstones. Okay, so that's what we normally would have done in this lab, is we would have looked at plastinated specimens, looked at wet specimens to just see that basic structure of the liver, the gallbladder, the pancreas, the small intestine, and noted this pathology. We also would have looked at anatomy. So we would have found these different structures on the cadaver. So if I move over to the next lab, and we would have found all these structures. I'm not as huge a fan of anatomy as I am physiology, so I'm a little bummed that we're not having access to the cadaver, but I think we still want to focus on the pathology. What you next would have done is look at slides. And before we look at slides, I think it's really important to talk about the structure of liver. So this picture is from Wikipedia. And so the liver is made of all these, they're called heptads or lobules, and they're six-sided structures. When blood goes through your digestive system, it's not put right out into the blood. So when you take something up in your digestive system, it heads straight to the liver. It's not just dumped right into the blood system. And where that blood comes in is these outer veins called portal veins. And what these portal veins will do is they'll bring in whatever's absorbed from the digestive system, and the fluid will meander by these hepatocytes, and it will be collected eventually by this says central vein. So these hepatocytes are doing a lot of things in order to condition the blood so that it's ready to be released to the rest of the body. So it's taking things out of your food, and it's also putting things into your blood. So we're going to draw a fairly complex drawing of all the things the liver does. And then we're going to come back and talk about how pathologies can be seen in the liver. So this is what it looks like on our slides. And I would say this is our portal vein. Sorry, this is our central vein. And then this is just a great example of when you look at a slide in a textbook, it often looks great because somebody worked really hard. But that's our central vein, and this might be one of our portal veins, and this might be one of our portal veins, and that might be one of our portal veins. And you'll notice that they kind of make, I missed one, a six-sided structure. Not exactly, but kind of. And so here's where fluid from the digestive system is going to come in here, and it's going to meander through and around these cells. The pink guys are the hepatocytes. The white is the fluid. And so the hepatocytes are going to process this fluid as fluid meanders, or blood meanders, from these outer portal veins to this central vein. So let's talk about what these cells are going to do. And again, this is going to be a fairly complex drawing. So let's get a blank page. So what we're going to put at the top is the liver. And even before I start, I like to point out a couple of facts that emphasize how important the liver is. And we'll just put those off to the side. The first one is that human cells have 20,000 genes. 20,000 genes. And they're not expressed in all cells, but 60% of all these genes are expressed in the liver. I mean, they're expressed in other cells too, but the liver uses a lot of genes. There are 1,000 genes only used by the liver. That's a lot of genes. I also just like to point this out too, is that you don't generally feel pain in internal structures, but liver, kidney, and intestine are pretty good at feeling pain. It tells you that evolution has decided that we need to know when those things are hurt. Even your heart is not very good at sensing pain. Okay, so let's start to draw a diagram here. And it's going to be, again, pretty complex. It's going to detoxify. That says detoxify blood. So it's going to get rid of toxins. You know, this is mildly inappropriate, but we're in anatomy, and so I think it's an okay kind of story to tell. But some people have discovered that if you drink alcohol and let it go through your liver, it's pretty well mitigated. Not well, because obviously you feel intoxicated, but if you compare it to taking in alcohol another way, and I guess I won't be specific, but people have found other ways to get alcohol into your body, then it's about 20 times, maybe 10 times as powerful. You can die from a shot of alcohol that gets into your body but doesn't go through the liver first. So that tells you the liver is pretty good at detoxifying. Another thing the liver does is it clears hormones. Maybe the biggest one to consider is adrenaline. So when you dump adrenaline from your adrenal glands, it can be filtered out by the kidneys, but also has to be filtered out by the liver. And the way to think about this is if you're really scared by something, it takes a while to come down. If you've had a big adrenaline jolt, it takes a while for things to come down because it has to go through your liver. Now this one's going to be fairly complex, so leave plenty of room here. But the liver stores vitamins. And it stores both your fat soluble and your water solubles. So your water solubles. And here, it seems like in this lecture, I'm mildly inappropriate, but again, the physiology is just cool. These are going to be your B vitamins. And what I'm getting at is if something is water soluble, your body can clear it in about 24 hours. So if you drink alcohol, alcohol is water soluble. It's basically out of your body for the most part in 24 hours. Whereas if you take something that's fat soluble, like THC or CBD, it generally can stay in your body for a month. And so you have about a 24-hour supply of water soluble and about a 30-day supply of fat solubles. And the other reason that's important is because fat soluble vitamins can be really toxic. Those would be A, D, E, and K. And then the other vitamin here that's water soluble is vitamin C. Now, what the B vitamins do, hopefully you've had some nutrition, and this is just a reminder. One of the main things they do is they work in the Krebs cycle, or citric acid cycle, we could call it. These are going to help make energy, and specifically ATP. So they help your mitochondria make ATP. If you don't have enough B vitamins, one of the first things that can be affected is you can have neurological damage. And I always like to point out to students, because I had an alcoholic uncle, and the main thing that would happen when he would stutter or he'd repeat himself, that damage is called Korsakoff syndrome, and it's caused by alcohol, but it's not caused so much by the alcohol toxicity as the fact that your liver is busy detoxifying rather than storing your B vitamins. And so now your B vitamins don't have enough energy and they die off. So it's kind of sad to say it this way, but if you have somebody in your family that overconsumes alcohol, you can definitely help the situation by emphasizing them taking their vitamins, especially their B vitamins. This also, another consequence of low B vitamins is a lot of ATP is used to constrict blood vessels. And if you don't have that ATP, then your blood vessels dilate. I'm going to just abbreviate it BV. And decrease blood pressure. So that's what can happen with B vitamin insufficiencies. Vitamin C is an antioxidant, which I won't go into too much detail, but oxygen molecules like to have electrons in their outer shell, and sometimes they lose it. That's what a free radical is called. And the problem with a free radical is it will go steal an electron from somewhere else and damage that molecule. And then that molecule will have to go and steal an electron from someone else, and that will damage that molecule too. So it's kind of like if somebody stole $10 of your lunch money and you're like, well, I got to eat lunch, so I'm going to go steal $10 from somebody else. But now you just stole that person's $10 and their lunch money, they're going to have to go steal. And so you're going to leave a trail of damage. And that's what free radicals do. Antioxidants come along and say, hey, I've got an extra electron, you can take it from me. The other thing that vitamin C does is it's really important for collagen. And collagen, remember you have 3 fibers in your body, 3 main fibers: elastic fibers, which are stretchy, and those are in your ear. You also have reticular fibers that are like nets, like fish nets, and they're not real important, but they're in lymph nodes to filter things out. But then you also have collagen, which is when you really want something tough, whether it's a blood vessel or the cartilage between your vertebrae or pubic symphysis, things like that. Collagen is really tough. I think about collagen as the body's duct tape because it also strengthens blood vessels. And so if you don't have enough collagen, you'll have leaky blood vessels. That says leaky blood vessels. And it leads to something called petechia, or can lead to even more problems. Petechia is when you get these blotches. Okay, so your liver is making sure all of these things down here at the bottom don't happen. Your fat-soluble vitamins, I always run out of a little space here, so I'm going to try and make this work, are A, and that helps in vision. That's also really important for IGs, so immunoglobulins. So it's an important part of the immune system. A also is an antioxidant. And obviously Orange foods have a lot of A, including carrots, and it's a myth, of course, but the carrots help your vision, but vitamin A definitely helps with vision. Then you've got D, and hopefully you know what D does. D is important for calcium. And then whenever I say calcium's an on switch because it helps neurons talk to each other. It's important in action potentials in the heart. It's important in muscle contraction. It's important in releasing hormones. Another thing D seems to do is it seems to, when we talked about the immune system, and it's a good time to talk about it too with coronavirus, because what coronavirus is doing is it's overactivating the immune system. So the immune system is overreacting, and that overreaction is what's killing you. So vitamin D also calms the immune system. So I guess that means make sure you're taking your vitamin D. E, this is vitamin E, is an antioxidant. And K is important in blood clotting. All right, so already seeing, wow, the liver does a whole lot because it's doing all these things down here. Next, I'm going to try and squeeze this one in at the top. It also makes albumin. And I'm going to switch to green because it seems like I always do albumin in green. Maybe not. I'm going to save my color for other things. You'll see. I will do this because you've seen this little diagram multiple times. That if you have an arterial, this is how I always draw them. And then this, of course, would be the capillary next. And then this is a venial. So we've talked about this before. We'll talk about it again. We said you push the fluid out with something called HPC. So HPC, and it's important to review these because we're going to do edema again. That's what pushes fluid out of the capillary. But what draws fluid back into the capillary at the other end, or even this end, but the way you get fluid back into the capillary was called OPC, osmotic pressure of the capillary. And if, again, you don't remember these things, go watch the edema video. But albumin is in your blood to draw fluid back into the capillaries. And so if your liver is not making albumin, you can't draw fluid back into the capillaries, and that leads to a disorder called ascites. So when your capillaries leak, one of the biggest places that fluid that's leaked can pool is in the belly, is in the gut. And so if you don't have albumin, whether it's because you're in liver failure, or it also is caused by kwashiorkor, which is when little kids have a sudden reduction in protein in their diet, then they can't make albumin and they get a really swollen belly. But both of these are going to be caused by, ascites is going to be caused by liver failure. And again, you'd think about this as the huge gut that happens in cirrhosis or a beer belly, honestly. Or it can also happen in kwashiorkor. Oh, you got to get this one right. Got to write this one right. It's a hard one to write. KWASHIOKOR, I think is the way. The other thing that albumin does, and we're going to come back to this, is albumin also regulates calcium. I like to say it this way, is calcium is really important, obviously, because it does a lot of things, like neurons talk to each other using calcium by releasing neurotransmitter. Calcium controls heart rate and heart strength. Muscles need calcium. Endocrine glands need calcium. Going back to muscles, if your diaphragm doesn't work, your respiratory system doesn't work. So you have to regulate calcium. So we could put it right here, if you remember these. That's a cardiac AR action potential that controls heart rate. Or remember this. That's a cardiac action potential where calcium is right there. And that leads to contractility. So calcium is pretty important in the heart. I mean, we could also put, let's go ahead and put those because they're important. Neurotransmitter release. That says neurotransmitter release. and muscle contraction. And again, you might think, well, I could probably go without muscle contraction for a while, but you can't because your diaphragm is made of skeletal muscle. So that would be breathing. This one's pretty simple, but pretty important. Is when we talked about blood, we talked about clotting factors. And what we talked about was that there's these things called fibrinogen. These are little proteins that are floating around in your blood. And when they get a signal from something called thrombin, they line up and they'll seal in platelets. So they'll make lines. So blood clotting is, but the liver needs to make this fibrinogen and this thrombin and these clotting factors in order for your blood to clot. Another simple one that we'll just put way under here is remember your immune system. Remember, one of the most important parts of the immune system, because it has a role in the second line of defense. It can find bacteria on its own, or it can be activated by antibodies, is complement. So that's immune. Another pretty important thing that the liver does is it makes cholesterol. And cholesterol gets obviously a horrible name. You got to lower your cholesterol. I mean, that whole theory has shifted, because now what we think is what cholesterol is doing is it's a repair mechanism. It's an attempt at like spackling your blood vessels back together. And so it's there to repair stressed blood vessels. So like collagen strengthens blood vessels, cholesterol strengthens blood vessels. Cholesterol also strengthens, this is going all the way back to AP1, it strengthens cell membranes. So back in the day, you'd have this picture of these little phospholipid bilayers, and there are all these proteins that were stacked in it. There were these little squiggles in the membrane that were cholesterol, and it thickens the membranes. And that's really important in what structure? Neurons. Neurons have to maintain this beautiful, complex shape. And those dendrites and that structure is maintained by cholesterol. And if you want proof of that, just look up, I used to use this in my nutrition class, but you can look up pork brains in milk gravy. They sell it on Amazon if you want to, but it has like 3,000% of the daily supply of cholesterol, because there's that much cholesterol in our brains. So I had a little computer glitch and had to restart. But anyway, what we're going to do is start to organize. Also, I realized that I was dropping off the bottom of the screen, so now I've moved this up so you can see this. But we're going to go with red is going to be cardiovascular. And again, I'm going to take my time, but we might have to go through this a little bit slow. So, I mean, that's definitely blood vessels. That's definitely blood vessels. Blood clotting, that's definitely important. Muscle contraction, although I suppose it's up here too. Fibrinogen and clotting, that's cardiovascular because that's blood and blood vessels. And then let's move to immune. So, right here, calms immune, complement, so that's going to be immune. Realizing now too that probably should have done this one as blood vessels. Let's do neuro. So that's definitely there. We'll count vision. Definitely Could put calcium in there because calcium is integral to the immune system. And I suppose it's the same there, so we could kind of link those two together. And then neurons and cell membranes. So that's neuro. Vision. I guess I have vision on there twice. And then, of course, there's just generally everything, which would be things like... So then let's just also do something that says all systems. And that's going to be the antioxidants. So antioxidants, everybody's prone to damage. Free radicals, toxins. I think that's it. I'm also realizing that I probably should have went back in another red one, because one of the main things adrenaline does is it kicks up heart rate. So by drawing this whole out, you can see, wow, the liver does a whole lot of things. So there's our whole drawing. Now I want to go back though and talk about the structure of the liver and how we can make all this stuff happen less efficiently. So here we're going to go look at 4 different slides. The first one again is normal. So this first one's going to be normal. And what I'd like you to visualize is that you are going to have all these hepatocytes doing all those things that we just talked about. So making complement, putting in blood clotting agents, putting in cholesterol, getting rid of toxins, things like that. It's going to do all those things we just talked about. And so there's a fairly important ratio then of cells to fluid. And so the fluid is going to, or blood is going to meander on through here. And those hepatocytes are going to do everything it's supposed to do. If we come down here, what do you think is the difference between up here and here? Well, the first thing that I notice is the coloration has flip-flopped. So up here, there's more pink than light pink. So that means there's more cells than fluid. But down here, there's more fluid than there are cells. And what does fluid mean? What's the term for fluid? This one's going to be itis. So hepatitis. Again, the way I look at this is there's too much fluid, so these cells are not able to process it well. The liver cells are still doing all those things that we just drew out, but they can't do them as well because either there's too much fluid and it doesn't get to the cells, or it goes through too fast, which means you're not able to process that fluid. So the liver cells are still pretty normal. Everything's pretty normal shape and everything. It's just everything is a little bit overwhelmed. So those normal functions are slowed down. Now what this one is it's a part of the liver that's pretty well damaged, and these purple cells are white blood cells, and they're laying down scar tissue, and that scar tissue is usually made of fat. But what you can definitely see is the overall structure has failed. So there's no longer a heptad. You can't really pick out central portal veins. I mean, they're there, but you don't have the normal 6-sided structure. I mean, you might say, well, here's one, and here's one, and maybe the central portal vein is right there, but you're definitely disrupting the system. And so this is cirrhosis. And I like to think in metaphors. So to me, this is like, well, part of your liver has been grenaded. So up here, there's too much fluid. Here, you've taken out some of the liver. And the cool thing about the liver is it can add on, so it can make more normal tissue. But the liver is going to get bigger and fill in with fat. Now, if this is grenades, imagine what it would look like if you had like bombs, like just huge bombs. And that's what this is going to look like. And so this is cancer. Liver cancer. And the way I like to envision this is, you know, in the other ones you still had this kind of heptad structure. And so you could still process, maybe not as well, but here you don't even have that structure. In fact, you might even push some of these vessels close to each other because the cancer is pushing things around, which means if you push one of these outer portal veins right next to the central vein, now you're not even processing it all. It goes straight to the central vein and you're not processing it all. So that's liver cancer. I'd also like you to look at small intestine, and I want to draw a little something there too. It's not nearly as complex. So here in the lab, you're supposed to draw those different liver functions. So it is going to be fair on the test to ask you to identify normal versus abnormal liver slides based on the pictures that you've been provided. I also want to do a little bit on small intestine. And so the key thing with small intestine is if you have problems with the small intestine, you're going to have decreased nutrient absorption. So I'd like to talk about that a little bit. I don't know how that happened, but that's supposed to say decreased nutrient absorption. And normally the small intestine is lined with villi, really small villi. But what happens in a decreased nutrient state is something comes along and cuts those off so they become smaller. Now it's estimated that your surface area, so your area of absorption in the small intestine, is about the size of a tennis court. So there's a lot of area to absorb nutrients. So I want to talk about how this can happen and the different types, and then talk about the effects. Now the two main types that you've probably heard of are Crohn's, but let's do celiac first. And then I want to mention another one because it's, DJ likes to talk about cluster messes. So you're in the hospital for one thing and it leads to something else. And a good example is villus atrophy. So celiac, most people have heard about that, is you have these microvilli, but then gluten, which can be a very sticky protein. Like I always think about when my grandmother back in the day would have Metamucil. It was kind of goopy. And so this is gluten. The problem is it can stick there too long. And another example of that would be Starling corn. This is kind of old, but they made a corn a long time ago. Say they were making just a biocorn, an engineered corn. And the problem is it would stick in the small intestine too long, so just like gluten. And what happens is the immune system comes along and says, well, I got to get rid of that gluten. And so what it does, like a lawnmower, is it just mows off those microvilli. And so that's pretty bad because now your microvilli are going to be really small. Crohn's is not specific to the small intestine, but its inflammation can be in the small intestine, anywhere in the GI. It can do things too, like just make the small intestine more leaky, then lets bacteria through, and then again the immune system comes along and attacks those microvilli. The other one, villus atrophy, is, again, it's one of those poor designs in our body that the way blood flows through this microvillus is it kind of climbs a ladder. And then it makes it across to a vein and leaves the microvillus. A problem, though, is if you have a hemorrhage or low blood pressure, low blood, so you're in a car accident and you've lost blood. Then what happens is you don't have enough pressure. So some sort of accident or lost blood. You don't have enough pressure to get the blood all the way up. So it only goes up part of the way. Which means, again, you're going to lose, because there's no blood flow, you're going to lose part of your villus. And so you're going to end up with small microvilli. So the cluster mess there is you're in the hospital trying to recover from an accident where you lost a lot of blood and you've killed off your microvilli because they didn't get enough blood, and now it's going to be harder to recover because you don't have as much nutrient absorption. Now, of course, I just want to clarify, what are the effects of all this? Of course, one of the effects to the patient that has one of these three things is you're going to have decreased nutrients, obviously. You're not going to absorb as much. So that's going to lead to things like pernicious anemia. Which one's that? Pernicious anemia is lack of B12, and that one's pretty important because B12 helps you make methionine, and methionine is your first amino acid in any protein you make. So if you don't have B12 and you don't have methionine, you can't make protein. This can also lead to hypotension because, again, how you get your blood vessels constricted to maintain blood pressure and maintain flow is ATP constricts the smooth muscle in blood vessels. So if you can't get nutrients and can't make ATP, That's going to be a problem. Let's make the other thing way down here so I have more room. Sorry. You're also going to have increased nutrients for gut flora, bacteria in your gut. And what's that going to do? That's going to cause gas. So these bacteria are going to make more gases, and so that's going to lead to things like bloating. So you're going to feel bloated, and it's also going to lead to things like diarrhea and pain. And I guess the bloating would also lead to pain, and this is also going to lead to diarrhea. So these are some of the symptoms of lactose intolerance or of Crohn's disease: are gas, bloating, pain, and then of course diarrhea as you try and get rid of those extra bacteria. Down here are some pictures, and the first picture is a normal microvillus environment, and the bottom one is celiac disease, where again you just kind of go through and mow it all off, and when you mow it all off, everything becomes flat. And you can kind of see it in pictures that this one kind of looks bumpy and fluffy, and this one looks smooth. So you've mowed off the microvillus, and when you've mowed off the microvillus, you can't absorb as much. All right, so that's it for the digestion lab. Thank you.